Unspoiled Network podcast.
This is Spoil Me, covering Mage, Errant, Book 7, The Last Echo of the Lord of Bells. Chapters 26 through 29, Final Approach, The Last Echo of the Lord of Bells, Off Balance, and Take the Plunge. In these chapters, the battle has finally commenced. And we find out that the last echo of the Lord of Bells is just a Lustin being like, you know what he really didn't like? I'm going to do something with that. Welcome to Spoil Me. Welcome to the show, everyone. I am Natasha. Thank you very much to Dan for commissioning this episode. What's up, Dan? So, I'm really going to start at the beginning only because the temptation to begin with the last echo is so great that I know it will take up the entire episode if I am not careful and don't watch my step. So, we are going to get there, I promise, you know we will, but everybody please be patient, because this is it's going to take a while. So, we start with Final Approach, and we are, the way that they have figured out how to sort of implement the principles of the kettle and these high altitude flights, they have figured out how to make bubbles. And they are really tricky to steer, if that's the right word. They'd figured out how to fly at that altitude, but not how to get to that altitude. The solution had stumped everyone until the heat and water archmage Tina Brand had pointed out the answer was staring them literally right in the face. Fort Maelstrom's tornado was a giant spiraling column of wind ascending even higher than they needed to go. Of course, ascending a tornado safely was much easier said than done. More, they had to very carefully limit the speed of their descent, or their ascent, or they risked giving their army the same, often lethal, blood injury water mages endured while ascending too fast without the right spells active. The bends. I wonder if it's still called the bends, if it's from being in the air. Like, I have to assume that it's the same name, right? So we don't get a ton of detail on this. And it's so funny, guys, because like my assumption here, the way this is written is Hugh didn't understand the precise nature of those solutions. He was still a neophyte in wind magic after all. But it had something to do with magically balancing the forces of the spinning outer wall and the inner updraft. And all I could think was, if the solution to this had involved stone, you had better believe we would have heard everything about it. It's just that Mr. Beers knows a lot more about stone than air, and so he's just like, yeah, we don't need to know. And I'm just sort of like, I low-key wish you would bring that same energy a little bit more often, sir, but you just can't seem to resist. It's okay, but you know, I clock it when it happens. So they're going up. It's fucking miserable, and it's miserable even though, compared to everybody else, they're in a way better scenario because they're actually in, like, one of Elenia's bubbles, which, because she is such a pro, they're managed better. And even so, it's just fucking awful. The whole way that this is being done, too, the point of this is they're creating an illusion army on the ground, which when we go over to Valia, like the Havathi seem pretty aware that it's an illusion. They're pretty certain, but they have not thought to look up the way that they would need to. So it appears that our guys are just straight up totally undetected from the moment they are up until they hit the ground, which is really, really something. And I like that Hugh is looking down at everything and enjoying the view, and it says, "It might not be as impressive as the view from Limnus's sky spear trees, but you were really missing the point if you solely appreciated the most impressive things you encountered." I really like that line. Just, sometimes a thing isn't like the best, but it's still its own thing. There's just a part of me that can be such a perfectionist that speaks to something in me a little bit. Far below them, there was another army of flyers, a truly masterful illusion, a perfect copy of their own army, projected downward and slightly to one side by Andis Thune. So there are bubbles that are separating from them, and they're going in a different direction. And it turns out that they are support staff. And they don't need to be at the fort anymore because the fort will not need to be supported. So they're being evacuated, and the bubbles are hugely helpful because normally you'd have to send a lot of battle mages with them if you want. Like, really, when I say this, you would have to send a lot of battle mages to protect them if you were going to be ethical about it, which I think a lot of bad people would not be. But in this case, our guys are actually giving a shit, and they are able to send fewer, just people who maintain the bubbles. So it doesn't subtract from their actual, working, fighting numbers, which is really nice. That's a nice perk. So then we go to Valia. Valia was proud of how patient she was when need be, but this weight stretched even her nerves. This is such an interesting thing, you guys. I was thinking about, when I read this line, it got me sort of thinking about patience and the concept of it and the ways in which patience can manifest differently, and how, you can be very patient in one respect and not in another. And I am the kind of person that when I'm waiting in a line, when I am waiting at a doctor's office, when I am waiting for somebody to get in touch, I have so much patience. I am able to just chill for 45 minutes, an hour, and just be like, well, not ideal, but things happen. Sometimes it's out of their control. I'm sure they're doing their best. I am so forgiving and willing to give grace. But I have absolutely zero patience when it comes to people not thinking things through and asking me a question they would have been able to find the answer to. I get so angry so quickly, or I have very little patience for things that take repetitive action and don't begin to pay off until you have been doing it a while. I am so impatient with that. I want immediate results. And so it's just, I was thinking about how patient she was when need be. And I'm really curious about the variety of ways that maybe she is impatient, that right here it's manifesting one way, but there are different types. Dan says, since moving to listening to podcasts at 2 times the speed, I can't handle people talking slowly anymore. Dan, curious about it. Is it weird for you to be here live where you can't speed me up? I don't know if, Dan, if you've listened to anything from Maximum Fun, but chances are you do, because it's such a huge network. And the guy who runs it, Jesse Thorne, he had this whole thing, probably 4 or 5 years ago, maybe longer, where he found out that people were listening to shows that he was on at 1.5 or 2 times speed. And he got so angry about it and was just like, we create these podcasts with a lot of attention to detail, and it's put up the way it's intended to be listened to. And if you're not listening to it on regular speed, then you're being disrespectful to the material that we have put so much of our energy into. And I was just like, I don't get it. If people are listening to your podcast, then who cares? If they're listening, that's it. That's the main thing. Who cares if they're like being like, it's a podcast, my guy. You know, it's not a grave site. You don't need to be respectful of come on. Dan says, I listen at 2.4 times now. Ooh, that's too fast. Oh, that's way too fast for me. Being live is okay. I can interact so it doesn't make me want to go crazy. That makes sense. When I miss an episode, though, you are 2.4 times. That is so wild. The fastest that I can listen is like 1.5. And 1.5 is kind of the top. Like, I don't usually like it. I have been listening to a lot of audiobooks at 1.2, 1.3. And for certain narrators only, because they are very, very slow. So anyway, so we are with her, and as they are getting everything, well, they're not just getting everything set up, it's been set up is kind of the issue. Heliothrax's new orders hadn't required them to move. Among the siege mages was as good a spot as any. At least it got her away from the deafening roar of Havath's colossal domed windshield, or the unpleasant crackle Havath's main defense ward made where the windshield blew against it. And I find that really fascinating, the idea that these spells make noises that are akin to electronic devices. And, you know, I'm personally very sensitive to the sound of electronics, which I know is a thing for a lot of people. Especially people who are not neurotypical. You can hear a television that it's on even if there's no picture. You can hear all kinds of I have a problem with one of the lamps in my office where if I turn it on, I have to have my headphones in and be working on something because it has this very shrill, high-pitched sound that I cannot take. So I have to have headphones in. But the idea that spells do that as well had never occurred to me. The colossal active defenses of Havath City were some of the most powerful, expensive magics on the planet. Running them even for an hour cost as much as running a large town for a year. But no one wanted to risk having the defenses down in case Alestin struck before his deadline. On top of that, the 7 massive marble and bronze war bodies of the Intertwined, each nearly as big as a Seekin Elder, had begun to twitch and shift as their enchantments activated in sequence. War bodies. What a cool idea. I love this concept. It's really, wouldn't it be nice, you know? This is some Avatar type shit, very literally. They are avatars of them. So this is when the messenger comes and tells her that they see the Coven's army. They are pretty sure it's not actually them, but they can't find where the real army is at. And then what about Alestin's army? And she says, what about Alestin's army? But this guy has called Alestin the last loyal son of Helicote. And I was glad that it was mentioned, because when he said that, I was sort of oh, that's weird that they're using that title. And it says, Valia tried to conceal her wince at the use of Alestin's title. Despite how hated Alestin was by Havath, they still used his title, not out of honor, but because they hated Helicote even more, and association with it was absolutely an insult to them. Something she'd dealt with for years. And that is, the thing about it is, there are so few survivors, I guess, that there aren't enough people left of Helicote to, get offended by this, you know? But it's wild that he's talking to her and he is still doing it. He's still saying it. But the point is supposed to be, I guess, that she is so divorced from her allegiance to Helicote that it wouldn't bother her, right? Oh yes, well, I'm not part of that anymore. And it ends with him being like, do you really think he's coming? And she's like, oh yeah, I definitely do. So then we go to Alestin, and he is in a great mood because shit is about to finally, after everything, pop off. And he is so like, he has been so riddled with doubt, and there's no time for any of that anymore. It's just focus and do the job. Also, I have to imagine he is just so excited about getting to show off, because it is truly a flex later on. And it must be so fun to like orchestrate something that intricate ahead of time and then actually get it to pay off, and it goes the way you planned, if not better than you planned. So the vibe here is just like a person who fucking loves attention sitting in their makeup chair, and they're getting their face did, you know, and they are about to go out there and they are fucking hype for it. That's the energy. And they, like, all of the people around him are sort of like, now we get like the fun Alustin, because you've been really fucking broody. But they sort of want to take it back pretty quickly, because he then starts talking about farming, and he describes the way that the Havathi have given over farmland to nobles who have no connection, and all they care about are yields. And so there is a sort of blindness to the long-term damage that they are doing in favor of the short-term increased yields. And I am just, you know, looking at the United States with a deadpan expression like Jim from The Office, because this is how we fucking function. And it is tragic, you guys. It's so, so tragic. Do you guys know that there are all of these like seeds out there that are developed in such a way that they will go bad on purpose so that you have to buy replacement for different crops? There are crops where normally you grow the thing, and if you harvest certain parts of it, you can use those parts to grow the next crop. And they have engineered them so that those parts are no longer fertile and will not propagate new crops. They've made them inert, basically, on purpose. And I can't, like, the concept of wanting to like just have a seed that serves only the purpose of being eaten the one time but doesn't propagate is so like offensive on such a basic level in terms of the point of the way our ecosystems work. It makes me so upset. Anyway, so he gets to the front and he begins his speech. First, he speeches to his own people about how they have like really fucking put us through it and told us that it's for our own good the whole fucking time. The audacity alone is worth them getting slapped down. And then we owe them a debt. Nobody's going to say we're cheap because we're about to pay it with interest. And then he steps outside and he begins his speech to the Havathi. And it's a really like before he begins, he notices that the Havathi are actually aiming their assault toward the Coven's forces, which he didn't think they were going to show up before he had done most of his own work. Like, his thinking here is that they would wait for him to take care of a lot of the city and then swoop in toward the end. And I think that based on what it is that he is going to do, they just don't want to risk, because they don't know exactly what the plan ultimately is, like how the tongue eater is going to be dispensed. So they can't really like afford to waste that time. They're not sure what he's planning here. And that's the part that I was surprised he didn't really think of, that they would be very eager to engage as soon as they could. But I don't know. So at this point, this he does his speech. Havath City, it's lovely to see you today. I'm glad you decided to show up for my party. I've never hosted an event commemorating the destruction of Helicote before, so I was worried no one would attend. This fucking guy is such a showboat. And like, we knew this, right? This is not news. We know this. But it is the seeing it on display the way it is here, him getting to truly indulge himself, and knowing as well that everybody who is listening is like, boo, hiss the whole time, and he's feeding off of that in a way, because these are all people that he fucking hates, you know? And that he, on top of everything, cherry on the sundae, he is explaining in a way something that he has been unwilling to tell even his allies up until this point. And so truly, it's not just the enemy that is his captive audience. Everybody who is listening is getting this information for the first time, and he has their complete focus, which is all he wants, because he loves attention. And I would just like to state for the record, I have no problem with that. The attention seeking, I relate, it's fine. But oh my God, he has taken it to such a fucking extreme. So he tells them that the force that he has weaponized against them is one that Havath themselves are famous for. It was something the Lord of Bells had learned to respect and fear over his centuries of life. Something that can move mountains, redirect rivers, and change the course of history. It can even, just to pick a totally random example, utterly shatter the defenses of an entire city. And that force? He asked, carefully watching the paper clock tick down the seconds to the exact anniversary of Helicote's fall. He didn't need to be so precise. He had built more than a little flexibility into the last echo, but he had no reason not to indulge his sense of drama. That force is bureaucracy. Alustin and all his paper copies snapped their fingers, simultaneously sending a magical signal to paper and ink glyphs hidden throughout the city, and Havath's defenses began ripping themselves apart. So I had said a while back, when I realized that he was changing the messages, that like basically people were having meetings and their memos were like changing on their table while they were looking at them. I was like, this is an incredibly dangerous power. This is so terrifying that he could just like, if he is aware of it, if he has it in his sights, that he could change it and make it say literally anything. And I don't think that I made any guess as to things like this, but it makes total sense that this is the way he has decided to disrupt things, because it is extremely practical. It is something that would make sense to have it all happen at the same time, so that there's this huge cascade effect, and it would be, you know, otherwise, like, you're getting inside defenses that otherwise it would be impossible. So you are softening up everything to make it easier to get in. The whole thing is wild. Dan says, I love this. Having the structure to solve logistics is why Rome became the most powerful empire in human history. It's everything if you do it right. And this is a really... this is sort of an interesting thing, because it ties in quite well with the book that I'm covering later tonight. There's a book series called The Dandelion Dynasty. And without getting too into spoilers, it's about the course of history in this area of a fictional country, and how they are being ruled by a tyrant And this upstart, who is nobody, eventually comes to rule, and he is excellent at managing people. He understands like how to read body language and see talent and choose the best people to take positions all around, his cabinets and everything, and is really egalitarian about even raising up folks who otherwise seem to have very few qualifications, because he can tell that they have the intelligence or the like novel thinking required to approach problems in a totally different way. So he creates this like wonderful government because he has elevated so many talents. But there is somebody who is watching all of this, and while they approve of his choices, their big concern is that he, as a ruler, has a unique talent for spotting talent. And what happens when he's not ruling anymore and somebody who doesn't have good judgment is the one taking over? So they begin to get very obsessive about the concept of bureaucracy, because they want there to be checks and balances for when somebody isn't great at that part of the job. Eventually this guy is going to die, So like you have to be prepared for the eventuality that maybe the people who take over, whether it's his own children or somebody else, that maybe they don't have the same capacity and vision that he does, but you need to make sure the government still functions in the best way it should. And so they get very, very intense about bureaucracy. And it's so interesting to read, because on the one hand, you totally understand their point of view, and they're not wrong. This talent he had was extremely special. And so they are the concern that it's all going to go down the toilet if the wrong person is in charge is valid. But they also have a sort of fear of anything that is unpredictable, because they want the world to be controllable in a way that it's just not, even with bureaucracy. So anyway, it's a really great series, and where I'm at with it now, I'm really not sure I'm going to cover it tonight, but the chapters I just read, I'm sort of like, did that just happen? I'm not even sure what happened. But anyway, so Dan says, this is kind of like Genghis Khan. He appointed Ugadai, who was as brilliant as he was, but when he died, no one's genius was there to take over, and the Mongolian Empire stopped expanding. Yeah, okay. That sounds like basically the same scenario, except this is not an empire that's trying to continue to expand. It is an empire that winds up getting invaded. And that's also part of it, is that, how does this work amongst when you're in an emergency situation like that? But anyway, so what we get after this is a description of how Alustin handled this, how he set this up. Now, I'm going to be honest with you guys. I really, really love the concept of how he did this. And I find it really interesting in theory how this all went down. But I don't think the way it's done here is the way to tell this part of the story. It feels like everything grinds to a complete halt for us to just get this exposition dump after the fact. And while I completely sympathize with how this author wants to keep it secret and then have the big reveal, and I respect and understand the drama of that, I think a better way to do this would have been to go into a flashback and see from Alustin's perspective a variety of things that he is doing, and they're each from a different moment. They're not necessarily all happening because he sat down at his desk and made all of these alterations at once. It would be jumping around to him looking through this plan and changing this, and we would actually get the action of the changes and see his mind at work in the moment and get more of a sense of like how much of this he decided sort of on the fly. Oh, this would be a good thing to change. Why don't I just tweak that a little bit? Or I have an overall plan for this whole section of the city, so I need to find certain places that I'm going to change this and that specifically. Like, you know, the difference between being an opportunist and also just like planning down to the fucking letter. I felt myself disconnecting the longer this explanation went on, and it went on a long, long time. And it was a shame because I found it so fascinating and satisfying at first, but by the end of it, I was like genuinely frustrated because I just wanted to get back to what was happening, because it felt like we had just been lifted straight up out of the action and held off to the side and made to read footnotes instead of getting to watch what was going on. And if you're going to take us out of the moment during like the climax of the battle, like one could call this, like, so far we're at a climactic moment, we're finally getting the reveal of this thing, to pull us out of it and just dryly tell us he did this, he did this, he did this, he did this, is really hitting the brakes in a way that doesn't serve the story. And I don't think it was a good call. So I have a really like, you know, I totally appreciate the plan and the like finding out exactly how he did all of this, especially with the ink, you know, affinity that he has developed, because this could not have happened if he didn't have that developed. But the way all this information is conveyed to us felt like a list. It just felt like, you know, we were just getting a straight up like bullet points. So let's see. Dan says, it's funny seeing people's personality. I loved reading what Alustin did and wish we could have gotten more of it. The details of what is going is part of why I like this series. Well, see, and that's the thing. It's not the details that I have the problem with. It's the way those details are conveyed to us. If we got these details in a series of flashbacks of him making the changes and us like, you know, and a series of small flashbacks where now he's here in this location and he has gotten a hold of these forms and he's changing this and that. And we get those where it feels like we're watching it happen in real time, even though it's from the past. You're still getting all of that detail, but it doesn't feel so totally disconnected the way that this felt for me. I just think that there is a way to get all of this information across without feeling like it's just being told, you know? So I'm just going to read some highlights of this. The first, to start off the way this is working. He turned to the history of his city's ruler. The Lich had in his youth been one of the most lethal sword mages the Cloudspine continent had ever seen. Brash, fearless, and quick to take offense, he'd eventually killed the wrong opponent in a duel and been forced to flee the continent entirely, hired assassins on his tail. He'd spent years wandering the world until settling down in eastern Ithos, discarding his name and beginning construction of his demesne. At the time, an absolutely peerless construction. There were lessons Alustin could draw from that masterwork of enchantment, but it was the next phase that was more illuminating, turning the demesne into a proper city. For a warrior artist like the Lord of Bells, little was more objectionable than bureaucracy. The drudgery of forms and regulations was anathema to every virtue he held on a pedestal, to his very sense of beauty, and his every attempt to found a functioning city without a bureaucracy was a miserable, ridiculous failure. It simply couldn't be done, not without leaving the city an inefficient mess that no one wanted to live in. Managing resources and personnel wasn't the sort of problem that simply became larger as the number of resources and personnel grew. No, it became an entirely new problem, at different scales. With some problems, sufficient quantitative change literally became qualitative change. Bureaucracy could handle those problems in a way individuals never could. Not always efficiently, and seldom in the most pleasing way, but it did handle them. The Lord of Bells had never learned to love or even like bureaucracy, but he'd absolutely learned to respect it. And when the Lord Citizen had decided to go war against Havath, to strike a preemptive blow against the Dominion, it had been the Lord of Bells to propose targeting Havath's bureaucracy, to shred their capability to manage their own empire, and to stave off their inevitable next war of conquest. And it had worked. Hellicote had been destroyed, but Havath's war-making capabilities were shredded for most of 20 years. So, he devised a dozen different tools. He used his ink, paper, and farsight to begin altering work orders and bureaucratic memos from hundreds of leagues away. One of his greatest advantages was the impersonal nature of bureaucratic communication. Often, orders could pass through dozens of people and multiple committees before getting enacted. It was trivially easy to slip small changes in, distorting the written plans at one point or another in a process. Of course, bureaucratic oversight likely would have caught many, if not most of them, under normal circumstances. That's why the evacuation had been necessary, to overwhelm the usual oversight procedures, to keep the Dominion bureaucracy merely treading water while it prepared for Alustin's deadline, to keep it from noticing Alustin's little changes. And all the changes, almost, were small ones. Volatile alchemical reagents meant to be stored in one warehouse were stored in the neighboring warehouse. A new set of fire wards being planned in an outlying neighborhood were moved a single street farther out. A mass grain requisition order had its date delayed a few weeks. Except the second warehouse had been behind on maintenance for years, and its containment tanks had significant corrosion in need of repair by metal mages. The new location for the fire wards brought them into interference range with both the main city ward and the granary's fire wards. And the granary, due to be emptied, was situated right between the fire ward and the reagent warehouse, and grain dust was delightfully flammable and explosive. It took only a spark in the Regent warehouse, provided by a single sheet of paper with one of Alustin's glyphs plastered to a particularly weak tank, to turn the building into a toxic fireball. In a bit of irony, Alustin had disguised the fire glyph as a safety warning about keeping fire away from the tanks. The neighboring alchemical warehouses didn't go up in flame, though their fire defenses were still in good condition. The full granary, however, its ward, struggling to function with the new fire ward so close by, failed to compensate, and the granary exploded, sending a burning, shrapnel-filled shockwave across its section of the city. This, in turn, was enough to overwhelm the fire defenses of the other alchemical warehouses, igniting them as well. The new neighborhood fire ward, unable to handle the multiple massive fires trying to cross it, overloaded swiftly. This would be bad enough normally, as it let the fire out. But with the interference from the main city ward in its new location, the ward overloaded explosively instead of just shutting down, which then put significant strain on the main city ward. Hundreds of Havathi soldiers, battle mages, and siege mages died in the blast, and even more were injured or scattered. Even better, all three targets sat right above one of the underground enchantments, allowing the intertwined to coexist safely with one another. The rapid series of explosions tore it to shreds, launching toxic enchantment shrapnel far into the air. Alustin didn't just have 3 targets, though. He had thousands. So, this is the moment right there. I'm cool with all this explanation and very fascinated by it. And I'm just like, oh shit. Right around here was when I started to realize that he is going to tell me a lot more. And I started to kind of be like, is he going to do it this way the whole time? Because I understood initially explaining how the wards getting too close, interfering with their functionality and all of that. You need to lay that groundwork for me to understand exactly how there can be this like ripple effect. But I felt like that was adequate. But so moving to the next like kind of big section, the reason Alustin had given a deadline, it increased the number of work orders fivefold and decreased oversight drastically. And even when his changes were detected, and quite a few were, they were assumed to be simple errors. In a less efficient, well-run system, his methods might not have worked so well. He would have had to spend hours tracking down the correct documents. Havath's bureaucracy, however, was standardized beyond any other state on the continent, and likely the entire world of Anastas. Once you knew the procedure and organization for one department, you could, with a little persistence and effort, figure out the procedures and organization for any other government department. It helped prevent too many corrupt or inept bureaucrats from establishing their own fiefdoms by making themselves irreplaceable. It helped allow for easy hiring and transfers, and it helped Alustin rig the system for its own destruction. So, again, right here, in my imagination, an alternate version of this information being conveyed to us, the reader, is Alustin using his affinity to leaf through paperwork and realize, oh, they're using a really similar filing system as this other department. And, oh, I need such and such. But I wonder if they even kept the receipts for that, or they kept the map for that. And then he goes and lo and behold, of course they kept it. They have everything because they're so organized. And him kind of cackling to himself at the fact that they are being so on point that it's making it easier for him. Like, this could be something that you get to see in a different way that feels to me a little more engaging. And also, I would just be fascinated the ways that he is focusing on doing this sort of thing while hiding it from everybody around him as well. So more than once, Alustin had idly wondered whether the Dominion's multiversal backers had been responsible for its bureaucracy. Regardless, he had taken full advantage of the navigability and orderliness to unleash a host of changes. Most of the vulnerabilities he'd targeted had been pointed out years ago by other librarians errant. They intended more conventional sabotage for those, but it had been trivial for Alustin to adapt their plans. A part of the sewer system needed upgrade, so Alustin happily made a few alterations, changed the pipe wall specifications to be just a bit thinner, increased the strength of the enchanted pumps just a bit above normal, and just like the reagent factory, he hid spell-formed glyphs on the labels on the enchanted machinery. In fact, he'd simply magically altered the ink on the back of pre-existing instruction sheets. Again, we could watch this actually happen. It just feels, I'm not going to do this with everything that he is, but I'm trying to just give you guys examples of what I mean, where I'm saying we could get all of this info, and it may even take longer to get it across because you're setting the scene in other ways, but we are getting to see it happen in a way that feels extremely immediate and like we are involved and that there is emotion behind every moment of it, because we are watching the way Alustin is reacting to finding out what's vulnerable and what he can target and suss out exactly how to make the changes he wants to get the result that he wants. There's just a lot of potential here that I feel is lost by simply being given all of this information in a kind of dry manner after the fact. So as the last echo rang, literal thousands of Alustin's paper glyphs activated. None were powerful on their own, but each triggered and catalyzed far greater processes. And the haste and lack of oversight had allowed him to easily make hundreds of subtle changes to their plans. Do you see right there? That sentence I just read. The haste and lack of oversight of the operation had allowed him to easily make hundreds of subtle changes to their plans. That is 3 pages in now of this whole explanation. And we absolutely don't need that sentence anymore. We know. We have figured it out. You have explained already that getting this evacuation set up, that there isn't enough oversight, and so small mistakes are overlooked. You have mentioned that more than once already. You don't need to keep just saying that to us. We get it. And that's part of the problem with like the dryness of it, is that it almost feels like he himself is writing this forgetting what he's already told us, because there's so much exposition like in this section that he's losing track of it a little bit and begins almost, I would almost call it over explaining, except it's not, it's just repetitive. He changed weapon positioning locations so trebuchets would be placed in the center of intersections filled with underground enchantments instead of a block or 2 away. He pushed ammunition drop points closer together, some close enough to risk resonance cascades, others merely close enough that loading crews would get in each other's way during the battle. He altered the figures on their pre-existing surveys to chaotically introduce errors into Havath's planning that even he couldn't predict. And oh, did it work. So I'm going to give you my ultimate mental alteration to this, because I'm picturing this the way it would be done cinematically, which granted is not always great on paper, but this is just what my head is doing as I'm reading this. I am turning this into something that's more immediately a payoff. So you have a flashback of Alustin looking at the sewer plans and being like, okay, what can I do here? And smiling to himself as he looks up information and finds it right away, and giggling as he makes XYZ changes and all this stuff. And you have this flashback italicized. And then you have unitalicized the present. Ruptures broke through cobblestones of several streets. A shoddy foundation on a merchant's house collapsed, forces wind mages to drop their work and move, and one of the Lich overlap enchantments is damaged. And while the evacuation had lowered the level of sewage, there was still plenty of sewage flooding the streets. So you go from the flashback of what he is doing to the present, and pipes explode. Sewage pours everywhere. And you get the present of him, because he has farsight. So he's watching this, of people panicking as they realize that the pipes, the fucking streets are breaking because the pipes are exploding. And the immediacy of that flooding and the stench and the danger of it. This feels so impersonal. There isn't a sense of it happening. It feels like I'm reading it in a textbook. So that's what I'm picturing, is like you have these and then you have the immediate, and it's sort of like in a movie where you would watch somebody on screen, like in something like a heist movie, like Ocean's 11. And you get to see in the present a thing that's very surprising happening. And you cut away briefly to them putting whatever pieces in place they needed to do in order to get that thing to happen. So that you can actually pair up. Oh, they set this in motion weeks earlier doing this thing. And there is a sense to it of you're watching both at the same time. You know what I'm saying? So also there's a fun little bit here about personnel assignments. He changes up where people are, and there are people who are working together like very closely who have huge grudges against each other. And then there's like, it says other changes were just petty and amusing. Lots of stationing officers together with well-known grudges against one another, putting ambitious young officers in pointless, unglamorous stations where they'd think they were being punished somehow. So picture Alustin looking at the list of these names and being like, oh, Gregory, you know what I'm going to do? I'm so sorry for this, Greg, but John, who slept with your wife, is going to be your second in command on this one. Give us some detail. What are the grudges about? Where is that coming from? Like, how does he know what their grudges are? Where is he getting that information? Is he watching them? Does he hear it in like rumor, secondhand? Is it in letters that he's been like spying on? You know, I want to know those details and get the life from it. Best of all, he'd been able to use Havath's own extensive personnel files to plan out all the changes. So if he's finding out that info, I mean, I would love to see the moment that he realizes, oh God, these two are going to fucking hate this so bad. And just like the joyful pettiness of putting them together, and maybe a brief moment of us getting to see them sniping at each other. You know, we could have one of the moments where, for example, the sewer pipes burst from the perspective of one of those two guys who is so busy glaring at this dude who fucked his wife that he does not notice the wave of sewage heading his way. You know what I'm saying? So 5 seconds after he snapped his fingers, the windshield collapsed entirely. Alustin's single riskiest but most devastating change. He'd meddled with the designs of the city ward itself. The Dominion ward crafters had used his deadline to inspect, fine-tune, and modify the main ward, which they had been wanting to do for years, lacking only the funds and authorization. His invasion had given them the perfect chance, and he'd taken advantage of their eagerness. He made plenty of minor changes to muddle efficiency, increase ward interference, and the like. But his most audacious change had been to completely reroute one of the biggest spellform lines in the whole ward, a primary backup for the main mana lines. It had been a supremely delicate act of sabotage, requiring him to change over a dozen different work orders and maps in under a minute, including altering the ink on one sheet that was still being carried by the ward crafter that penned it only heartbeats before. That is suspense. I want to see that. I want to see him doing that. Like, this is like hacking. This is like watching somebody hack on a computer while you cut to the person in the office inputting the correct information, and they turn and look at the screen because they feel like they just saw something move, but then they dismiss it. Nope, I don't, it must have been my imagination. And it's tense, and it makes you just go, oh my God, is he going to get away with it? Oh my God, what is he doing? What is this even going to do? Like, this is what I'm talking about. And the idea that he's like, these tiny little increments, they all add up to this thing. That sounds so fun to me, you know? The further changes Valia had pushed for in the ward to make it more resistant to massive explosions after his false hint in the ruins of Hellicote only helped make his sabotage more effective. Can I just say how fucking bad I feel for Valia? She's out here just doing her best. She's trying so hard. And he's just out here like, that chump. Thanks for helping me out with this. Like, I only hope that she never finds out how bad she fell for his shtick, because she'd be so mad. When the countless acts triggered, when the main mana lines began to strain, mana was instantly shunted into the primary backup spell form, which instead of stabilizing, sent mana head-on into another major mana current. The resulting turbulence propagated through the entire main city in just a second, and not even 9 seconds after Alustin snapped his finger, the main city ward went down. In some places, the glowing blue dome simply evaporated, and in others, the spell form exploded from the ground with more force than anywhere else in the city. And that activated the next level of sabotage. So we're not even like, this is like, we're 30% of the way there with this? Like, not even. Alustin had shifted the map of temporary street wards slightly but critically during their planning phase, making more changes than to any other system. These wards, built in just a few short weeks, were intended to activate if the main city ward fell. They were meant to slow street-to-street fighting, bottleneck foes in choke points, block off major boulevards, partition the city sky into impassable chambers. With alterations, he had turned the entire ward system into a giant version of Hugh's ward stones, little explosive marbles that he liked to throw around in battle. The coexisting enchantments failed completely. The Lich overlap effect snapped into full force. 6 bronze and marble Lich avatars began to scream in pain with voices like thunder. And the 7th crumbled as the Lich died instantly. The 7th Lich, by no coincidence, had been the one whose demean encompassed Alustin's landing site at the city's edge. And all the devastation had Havath's own bureaucracy to blame. Little errors and changes made by a lone book mage familiar with every in and out of the Dominion's labyrinthine, oh my god, that word is so hard for me to say, civic management had tricked the bureaucracy into turning against its own city. I really don't need that again. I get it. It was reminiscent of nothing so much as the way certain particularly nasty plagues subverted the body's own defenses. For every change that took Alustin a few seconds or minutes to make, the Havathi bureaucrats had put in dozens, hundreds, or even thousands of hours of work preparing his sabotage. I like the comparison to like a plague. The way that cancer propagates, it takes over the way that your body is attempting to heal itself and makes more of itself. Like it's really perverting the purpose of the repairing that your body is attempting to do. So the stone platform carrying Alustin and most of his great powers sailed right through Havath's defenses essentially unopposed, and came to a halt at the entrance of one of the city's great boulevards. The few soldiers and battle mages there to witness them were cut down in heartbeats. Alustin rolled his shoulders and cracked his neck as he stepped off the platform. Well then, let's get to work, shall we? Everyone on the stone platform just stared at him. And when somebody is like, so wait, how is this bureaucracy? He says, I'll explain when you're older. Which I did really enjoy that. That was a good line. Oh, he's so infuriating. Even when he's like explained it some, he won't actually explain it. And you know these people are destined to die, so he doesn't intend to ever explain, which is just the worst. So there's a moment here with the tongue eater, and it's an interesting thing where he's sort of thinking that maybe the tongue eater is more than just a repository for stolen languages, and there's a sense of satisfaction to it knowing that it's going to be used soon, and he's getting kind of creeped out by it, but not enough to ever reconsider what he's doing. It's just, and the fact that it's easy to hold it back in a way that it didn't used to be, I am kind of worried that it's not actually being held back and that he just thinks it is. And the fact that it seems easy is actually a red flag, but I can't prove any of this. So I'm trying to see. I'm so out of time. Oh my God. I didn't even realize, because I knew that was going to take forever to go through, but I had to do it. That's like a huge moment, In those few writings on the topic he had ever found, it was unanimously agreed that few other worlds required so many toxic alchemicals as Anastan enchanting did, and even fewer had weaknesses comparable to the risk of resonance cascade, which is really interesting. There were legends of worlds where mages could wear dozens of enchantments safely. Alustin suspected they were just legends, of course. But one of the things they did agree to, it was possible for a resonance cascade to damage alien enchantments, and he'd already possessed the perfect tool for weaponizing that knowledge. And of course, it's learning from Kandaron Crux. When he'd stolen the Tongue Eater, however, that old knowledge had reared its head, and he'd been able to swiftly pen a design for the Resonators. Triggering the resonance cascade was the easy part. It took no special knowledge. The specific arrangement of the resonators was the most important contribution by far. So we get this bit. Xerxen Grey wasn't the most useful in direct combat, but she was perfect for controlling battlefields. She wasn't going to be enough, because barely a minute after their landing, most of Havath's great powers had recovered from the chaos. From a palace on the left side of the city, a great burning form, larger than Kandaron, rose into the sky. Sarkis Vi, the Phoenix Mercenary, which apparently this mercenary demands quite a fee. So the fact that they are here, that's saying that they spent a bunch of money. And Havath had secretly hired the Mud King. Alustin had thought the man hated Havath as much as Sarnassus, but he was incredibly hard to kill, even among armor mages, and Alustin wasn't sure any of his own great powers would be effective against the man. A horrible flame rose into the sky, so painfully bright it could be seen even through Xerxen's smoke cloud. Nyana Everflame, Havath's white phosphorus mage. And we get the, information here about how she was retired, but she is back with this like awful ability that kills her as she uses it. Alustin would be shocked if there weren't other great powers heading their way as well. As if that weren't enough, dozens of dragons were already rising into the sky and heading their way. Alustin his attention is dominated by the absence of Heliothrax. He's like, where is this bitch? There's no reason for her to wait. We know she's here. Like this, there's not like an element of surprise to this. What's the deal? And I am not looking forward to seeing what she looks like. What's going on with her? The second thing was the abrupt leveling of half the Conclave's immense palace in the center of the city in a series of completely unanticipated explosions. Oh God, yeah. Sorry guys. Dan is in the chat saying white phosphorus hits harder as Israel uses it on Gaza. Listen, I don't have the time. I'm already over time. Don't get me started, Dan. I didn't see earlier you said Valia is like your normal protagonist, while Alustin is our power gamer approaching things from a 90-degree angle. I feel so bad for Valia, dude. I really do. She's just trying to play and have a good time. She's not trying to, and Alustin's out here speed running. Oh man. All right. So I'm going to say this, Dan. I'm going to do a quick summary of 29 at the start of the next episode because I'm already 10 minutes over. I just don't have time. Most of what's going on in chapter 29 is our friends coming in for a landing and the intensity of like the descent, which won't take very much time to talk about. And also like a moment with Hugh being incredibly badass looking. So I will get to this, but I just don't have time. So apologies to everybody, but I really appreciate all of y'all. It's, I hope that, Dan, that my reimaginings of what that reveal could have been like didn't dampen things, because I love the reveal, like in principle. I just really feel like there was a way to explain it that was more engaging. So it's just the sort of thing that it's like, I feel like we got sort of a storyboard more than we got the moments. And I want to see the moments. I would be down to like do a little fan fiction, you know? Anyway, all right. I will see you guys again next week, Tuesday. Hope that y'all can come hang out and that you're enjoying the coverage. Until then, toodaloo, motherfuckers.
That was an Unspoiled Network podcast.